also talked about Secretary Pompeo, but he was very...
Here it is.
The people in the room,
The impeachment of Donald Trump.
Asserted this to me.
That's right. The impeachment of Donald Trump.
Were you encouraged as of your last day in the office that U.S. policy towards the Ukraine was headed in the right direction?
I was not.
And why was that?
Well, I was concerned about two things in particular. One was, again, the removal of our ambassador. And again, I will say for the record that the President has a perfect right to remove any ambassador at any time for any reason. But I was very concerned about the circumstances in which her reputation had been maligned repeatedly on television and in all kinds of exchanges. I felt that that was completely unnecessary. If the President wanted to remove an ambassador, which he did quite frequently, there was a number of ambassadors removed who were not political but career officials. That was done, but without these kinds of interventions. I wondered what that message was being sent. So there was that. And then on the second front, it was very clear at this point that there was, let's just say, a different channel in operation in relations to Ukraine, one that was domestic and political in nature, and that was very different from the channel or the loop, however you like it, that I and my colleagues were in, where we were focused on bilateral relations and US foreign policy toward Ukraine. And these two things had diverged at this point.
In the run-up to Ambassador Yovanovitch's separation from post, did you have any communications with officials at the State Department about your concerns?
I did.
And who did you relate those concerns to?
I related those concerns directly to my counterpart, who was Acting Assistant Secretary Phil Rieker, who I know you've spoken to. I also spoke to David Hale in the context of larger meetings about many other issues. I mean, again, I covered a broad portfolio myself, and we often would talk about individual items. And I had private discussions with Deputy Secretary Sullivan, and he, of course, has appeared before committees here in the course of his nomination to be ambassador to Russia, and has spoken about that himself.
Okay, and you advocated to all those officials about your concerns about the information being spread about Ambassador Yovanovitch?
I did, that's correct.
The Trump administration changed courses from its predecessor and provided lethal defensive assistance to the Ukraine. Were you in favor of arming the Ukrainians with the javelins?
I was not initially in 2015 before I joined the government, and I'm sure that many people on the committee have seen that I wrote an opinion piece with a colleague at the Brookings Institution in that juncture, because I was very worried at that particular point in time that the Ukrainian military was not in a fit state to really take on board sophisticated weapons, be they defensive or offensive weapons. And I worried that there was not a long-term sustainable plan given the overwhelming force that the Russians could apply against the Ukrainians. However, when I came into government in 2017 and started to interact with all of my colleagues in the Pentagon, and you had Laura Cooper here yesterday, I realised in fact that there'd been an awful lot of work done on this, and that there was a clear and consistent plan for the sustainability long-term of the Ukrainian military, so I changed my mind.
Okay, and you're in fact one of the, I believe the only witness that we've spoken to that has been able to articulate the opposition to providing the javelins. And as we understand it, during the Obama administration, the interagency consensus was in fact to provide the javelins, but they were not provided. Were you aware of the decision back then?
I was, and I think it was very much made on a political basis about concerns that this would provoke the Russians, depending on how this was presented. And we were very mindful of that also when there were the discussions internally about the lethal defensive weapons inside of the administration.
Mr. Holmes, you're on the ground in Kyiv, and the javelins have now been authorized, provided. What's the view from the field, the U.S. Embassy, as to the effectiveness of the javelins?
They're an important strategic deterrent. They're not actively employed in combat operations right now, but the mere idea that were the Russians to advance substantially using certain kinds of armor, that the Ukrainians would have this capability, deters them from doing so. And it also thereby sends a very important symbolic message to the Ukrainian military that they have access to this high-end technology and that we trust them to do it. I'd only add also that they've offered to buy some using their own funds. The initial tranche was provided through basically a program to do that, but they've now offered to spend their own money to buy more. So I think they think they're important.
And Ambassador Taylor has testified, Mr. Kent has testified that this is the consensus of the interagency providing the javelins. Is it the in your experience of working with Ambassador Taylor, was he also very much an advocate for this?
Yes.
Mr. Holmes, I want to go back to name some Americans. Now I want to talk a little bit about Ukrainian government officials.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with Sergei Leshchenko?
Yes.
Have you met with him?
I have.
He was a journalist, then he was in the parliament. Is he currently in the parliament?
Journalist again.
Journalist again. Are you aware that when he was in the parliament that he had provided information to a Fusion GPS operative named Nellie Orr?
I'm not aware of Nellie Orr. I'm not aware of who he provided information to. I'm aware that as a journalist, he's provided information.
Well, he was in the parliament at the time. This is in the 2016 campaign. He provided widely known as the Black Ledger. Have you ever heard of the Black Ledger?
I have.
And the Black Ledger, is that seen as credible information?
Yes.
The Black Ledger is credible.
Yes.
Bob Mueller did not find it credible. Do you dispute what Bob Mueller's findings were? They didn't use it in the prosecution or in the report?
I'm not aware that Bob Mueller did not find it credible. I think it was evidence in other criminal proceedings. Its credibility was not questioned in those proceedings, but I'm not an expert on that matter.
So the motivation for Leshchenko, as was reported to, was to go after a Trump campaign official and undermine Trump's candidacy. Are you aware of that?
If you mean by the release of the Black Ledger, I think Leshchenko's motivation was the same motivation he's always expressed, which is to expose corruption in Ukraine.
Right, but he's admitted motivation was to partly at least undermine the Trump candidacy that he did not support.
He has not said that to me.
That's better.
If he said that to you, I'll take your word for it.
And you're aware that you heard Dr. Hill's testimony, but the Steele dossier that contained that initial information that was fed in the FBI, were you aware that the Democrats had paid for that information?
So, sir, I never had any involvement directly with
I'm
it.
not accusing you of involvement, I'm just asking if you, not even if you knew at the time, but you now know today that the Democrats had paid for that information.
So I do want to be clear that all that happened before I arrived in Ukraine, so I don't have any firsthand.
Not accusing any involvement of you with the Steele dossier.
I understood, but I do want to be clear about that. And then in addition, I have read about those issues, but I'm not an expert on them.
But you're not disputing that the Democrats and the Clinton campaign were the source of funds that funded the Steele dossier.
I wouldn't be in a position to dispute that, sir.
Do you think it's appropriate for political parties to run operatives in foreign countries to dig up dirt on their opponents?
No.
Dr. Hill, do you think it's appropriate for political parties to pay operatives to dig up dirt on their opponents?
I do not.
Mr. Castor.
Turn to the President Zelensky's inauguration. Ambassador Volker testified that he was very pleased with the size of the delegation, although the vice president was unable to make the trip. Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, Ambassador Sondland, and I understand, Dr. Hill, you were involved with some of the logistics and putting the delegation together. What can you tell us about the vice president's role in attending or not
That's
attending?
better.
Well, I know that you've had the testimony of Jennifer Williams from the Vice President's office, and I defer to her as being much closer to the decision-making about the Vice President's attendance. I will say that I and many others hoped that the Vice President would be able to attend. And what I know from my perspective, because I was not involved intimately in discussions with the Vice President or his immediate staff, was that there were some questions about the schedule. As you all know, the President and Vice President can not be out of the country at the same time. And there were some questions about presidential travel in the same time frame. There was quite a bit of back and forth as to whether it would be really feasible for the Vice President in that time frame to go. So that was what I was aware of. I wasn't aware to the extent of the discussions that obviously Ms. Williams was involved in.
Right, the president was traveling in Japan, and then he was headed to Europe for the D-Day anniversary. The vice president's office, according to Ms. Williams, provided 4 days, the end of May, the 29th, 30th, 31st, June 1st. And as it turned out, the Ukrainians decided, I believe it was on May 16th, to schedule the inauguration for 4 days later. And by this point in time, the vice president had been rerouted for a trip to Canada about the USMCA. And I just want to ask you whether you don't have any evidence that the vice president was encouraged not to attend for any other reason, do you?
I personally do not, but again, I defer to Ms. Williams.
And Ms. Williams' testimony was that she heard from the chief of staff's assistant that the vice president was not able to go. The leap, the reason for that was related to any of these investigations hasn't been fully established. I want to just note from the materials you provided for your deposition, there was a discussion whether President Orban may have influenced President Trump's decision on that May 13th day. And do you remember when the meeting was with President Orban?
I do.
When was that?
That was in May, that's correct.
So do you remember what time of day it was on the 13th?
To be honest, usually these meetings are around lunchtime, sometime in that time frame, in the kind of early to mid part of the day.
Right.
But I can't speak for sure, and I just want to be very clear that I cannot speak about head of state engagements.
Okay. Jennifer Williams testified that she learned about 11 or 11:15, and the meeting with President Orban was not scheduled until later in the afternoon. According to your schedule, it was right around 1:45. Is that consistent with your recollection?
Well, about the lunchtime time frame, yeah. Depending on when one has lunch, I guess.
But overall, given the 4 days' notice, given Secretary Perry's involvement, do you think the delegation was a good-sized group?
I do, and let me also make a point that we don't try to make these delegations large. This is on the taxpayer's dime, and it's pretty expensive getting people there if you have to get military air, and we try to keep them small. If we had a longer lead time, perhaps we would have made other arrangements, but 4 days is not a lot of time to make an arrangement.
And Secretary Perry had become interested in some of the energy-related issues in the Ukraine.
I actually recommended that Secretary Perry be the lead, along with others.
And what can you tell us about his involvement in some of the Ukrainian policy?
Well, Secretary Perry's engagement in this made, again, perfect sense, given his role as Secretary of Energy, also his deep knowledge of the energy industry, his former governorship. Secretary Perry himself is an extraordinarily good advocate of US interests, particularly in the energy sphere. And one of Ukraine's Achilles' heel, in addition to its military disadvantage with Russia, is in fact energy. Ukraine remains for now the main transit point for Russian oil and gas and pipelines to Europe. And this has been manipulated repeatedly, especially since 2006, by the Russian government. And in fact, many of you here will remember in the Reagan era, there was a huge dispute between the United States and Europe about whether it made sense for Europe to build pipelines from the then Soviet Union to bring gas to European markets.
Mr. Holmes, what was your view of the delegation? Do you think it was the the right size group, right level of prestige to signal to the incoming Zelensky administration that the U.S. stands behind them?
I think it was fine in that regard.
Okay.
Since we're on the topic of Ukraine energy, I think it's a good way for us to segue into Burisma, which I assume both of you are familiar with. You've heard about it for many, many years. You're on the ground there now, Mr. Holmes. I know you weren't there, but at the time, but in September 2015, then Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, Obama appointed career ambassador. I'm sure you know him.
I do.
Credible,
Yes.
successful ambassador, I'm sure. He called for an investigation into Zlochevsky, the owner of Burisma, president of Burisma. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Did you know about Deputy Assistant Secretary of State's Kent's concerns about the potential conflict of interest with Hunter Biden sitting on the board of Burisma?
I would defer to George Kent, who was involved at the time and is an expert on those issues.
Did you know that the financial records show that this Ukrainian natural gas company, Burisma, routed more than $3 million to the American accounts of Hunter Biden?
I've heard that.
Were you familiar with that, Dr. Hill?
Only from newspaper reports.
Okay. Did you know that Burisma's American, and this is back to you, Mr. Holmes. Did you know that Burisma's American legal representatives met with Ukrainian officials just days after the vice president announced the firing of the country's chief prosecutor?
No.
Here it is.
Did you know that
The
Burisma's
impeachment
American
of
lawyers
Donald
tried to secure a
Trump.
meeting with the new
That's
state
right.
prosecutor the same
impeachment
day the
of Donald
predecessor
Trump.
Dr. Shokin's firing was announced?
No.
Did you know that Joe Biden called Ukrainian President Poroshenko at least 3 times in February 2016, shortly after the president and owner of Burisma's home was raided on February 2nd by the state prosecutor's office?
No.
Did you know that Devin Archer and Hunter Biden reached out to the Deputy Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, shortly after the raid on Burisma?
No.
So, Dr. Hill, did you know about, I don't want to go through and ask all those questions over again.
I also did not know if that's
You did not know about
I did
any
not
of
know,
those?
no.
Okay. So, you obviously know that the president had concerns about Burisma, had concerns about 2016 election meddling by the Ukrainians. When you were in there as the head of the Ukraine desk, did you ever raise any of these? Did you ever brief the president or raise it up to Ambassador Bolton about any concerns through 2017 and 18 that concerned 2016 election meddling or Burisma concerns?
The whole briefing process didn't really work in the way that you're suggesting there. So if the president had asked about any of this information, it would have been provided for him. Just to be very clear, Ukraine was not a top foreign policy priority in this period, in the same way that many other issues that we could talk about, from Syria to Turkey and others, are. So there weren't that frequent briefings on Ukraine. The briefings would take place when there was a scheduled meeting with the Ukrainian head of state. And as we know, there haven't been too many of those.
So just to, as far as you know, you did no briefings, no papers, answered no questions as it relates to the 2016 election or Burisma during your time there?
No, I did not know.
Mr. Castro?
And Dr. Hill, you told us during your deposition that indeed that there are perceived conflict of interest troubles when the child of a government official is involved with something that government official has an official policy role in, correct?
I think any family member of any member of the US government, Congress or the Senate is open to all kinds of questions about optics and of perhaps undue outside influence if they take part in any kind of activity that could be misconstrued as being related to their parent or other family member's work. So as a matter of course, yes, I do think that's the case.
Getting back to Ambassador Sondland, you testified that every now and then he made a habit of name dropping his interactions with the president.
That's correct, yes.
And I believe he also told us that there were instances where you would run into him on the campus and he would say, oh, I'm here to see the president, or I've been in to see the president, and you had an occasion to circle back and found out that wasn't the case.
That's correct.
And I just want to give you an opportunity. He testified about some sort of coffee he had with you on your last day, and I think when the deposition transcript was released,
Here it is.
your
The impeachment of Donald
counsel,
Trump.
indicated that that was completely fabricated on Ambassador Sondland's
That's
part. I
right.
just want to give you an opportunity to address that.
Yes, I mean, unfortunately,
The impeachment of Donald Trump.
We don't have coffee machines, readily in our office. If you'd come to my office in that time, the best I could have offered you was a cup of water from the water fountain outside of my office. So, the coffee that Ambassador Sondland and I shared was actually, we ran into each other, or rather he found out I was going to be there and then asked me to meet him for coffee in Jackson Hole, Wyoming in 2018 in August. So this is a full year before I left. That was a very nice coffee, so perhaps he, conflated